I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and U.S. President Joe Biden are to hold a virtual meeting Tuesday, a little over a month since President Biden was sworn in. The Prime Minister's office says the leaders intend to discuss shared priorities as well as efforts to address the global COVID-19 pandemic. Some areas of concern include President Biden's cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline and a stated intention to pursue Buy American policies. A record number of COVID-19 vaccines from both Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna are set to arrive in the country this week, more than 640,000 in total. Several provinces are now expanding their vaccination programs beyond long-term care homes and frontline health workers. Nova Scotia, Ontario, and Alberta will now begin targeting senior living in the community. On Friday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau urged provinces to get ready for what he called the big lift of vaccine doses. Chief Public Health Officer Dr. Theresa Tam says Canada is at a critical juncture in the fight against COVID-19 variants as the more contagious strains spread across the country. Dr. Tam says overall collective efforts to fight the virus are paying off as infection rates continue to decrease while vaccination numbers increase. But she notes that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on racialized communities, which she says reflects existing health inequities. New, more strict public health measures are now in effect at Canada's land borders and airports in an effort to prevent more contagious strains of COVID-19 from spreading further across the country. Most incoming travelers will need to get tested for the virus upon arrival and again towards the end of their mandatory 14-day quarantine. Travelers arriving at land borders will be given self-swab kits, and testing will be provided on site at 5 high-volume border crossings. Those arriving by air will be required to stay 3 days at a federally approved hotel at their own expense. The head of the Canadian Medical Association says people struggling with persistent symptoms after recovering from COVID-19 need a physician to manage their care and make referrals to specialists. Dr. Ann Collins is urging the federal government to boost funding for more family doctors so long haulers who are sick with COVID-19 get the care they need. Without a family doctor, COVID-19 long haulers are dependent on walk-in clinics for treatment, and as a result, no single primary care provider has a full understanding of their condition. A new study published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal shows more people are facing severe disease at a younger age. The pre-pandemic findings, based on a decade's worth of Ontario health data, points to future risks for adolescent patients and greater demand for healthcare resources. The biggest percentage increases in major chronic conditions involved congenital respiratory disorders and transplants. The study noted the biggest jumps in mental health issues involved eating disorders and disorders due to brain injury or illness. A new research vessel for the Canadian Coast Guard is expected to cost nearly $1 billion, close to 10 times the original estimate when the federal government launched the project more than 10 years ago. News of the skyrocketing cost comes as two highly anticipated reports on Ottawa's efforts to build new ships for the Royal Canadian Navy and Coast Guard are set to drop. The Parliamentary Budget Office will present its estimate on Wednesday on how much Canada can expect to pay to build 15 new warships for the Navy. There's research suggesting that businesses owned by women have been hit harder by the COVID-19 pandemic than those owned by men. Even industries that are normally dominated by women are seeing male-owned businesses recovering significantly faster. The study from accounting software firm FreshBooks says women have more often been saddled with child and elder care as well as household chores during the pandemic. An online petition is asking for Canada's largest Indigenous language group to be added to the Google Translate app. There are more than 96,000 Cree speakers, according to a 2016 count from Statistics Canada. The petition notes that the Maori language of New Zealand's Aboriginal people, with about 50,000 speakers, is already on the app. Alberta RCMPs say they will consult with provincial health authorities in their investigation after an Edmonton area church once again held services exceeding COVID-19 gathering limits. Sunday's message at Grace Life Church chastised other churches for following the restrictions designed to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Grace Life pastor James Coates was arrested last week when the church continued to hold services that police allege violated COVID-19 restrictions. He remains in custody for refusing to agree to bail conditions. All right, stay with us. After the break, we take a deeper look into the federal government's new gun control laws and how the proposed buyback program could impact Canadian taxpayers. We spoke this past week with Aaron Woodrick, federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, about these laws, the history of the buyback program, and what it could mean in terms of future expenditures. That story and more national and international news from this past week coming up next. The federal government's ban on assault-style weapons and the upcoming voluntary gun buyback program is getting criticism from both sides of the spectrum. Gun control advocates say the law does not go far enough, claiming that there should be mandatory laws around gun buybacks and a national regulatory plan rather than allowing municipalities to ban handguns through bylaws. Those against it say law-abiding Canadians and firearms retailers should not be targeted by the government, and the feds should instead invest in anti-gang and gun units and work to prevent illegal gun smuggling operations. The gun buyback program is a part of a series of gun control measures promised by the Trudeau government in their election campaign in 2019. However, this isn't the first time that Canada tried to introduce a gun buyback program. One introduced by former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien in 1995 ended up ballooning the federal tab to a whopping $2 billion, compared to the $2 million in expenditures that was originally promised. So what does the future of the currently proposed gun buyback program look like for Canadian taxpayers? Well, joining us now is Aaron Woodrick, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Welcome back to Forum Daily, Mr. Woodrick.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off by discussing this gun buyback program. How will it work according to officials?
Yeah, the government has essentially come up with a list of weapons that they say they want to get out of the hands of Canadians. And so they're going to pay money or near market prices to the owners of those weapons to buy them back and destroy them. Now, the interesting thing is it's optional. So you don't actually have to participate in the program. That raises a lot of questions about how it will work, exactly how effective it will be, and of course, how much it's going to cost.
And as mentioned, this isn't the first time a gun buyback program was introduced. I want to go back to Jean Chrétien's gun buyback program. How did it all pan out, and how does it compare to the currently proposed buyback program?
Yeah, it was a little bit different, but it's still a very big cautionary tale. It was a registry. So they weren't planning to take the guns away from you, but you had to register the guns. Obviously, it's become very infamous. It was originally supposed to cost $2 million. It ended up costing $2 billion. That's 1,000 times more than they had promised it cost. And that's exactly the reason groups like ours are very concerned about this new proposal, because what the government says it's going to cost rarely ends up resembling what the actual cost to taxpayers is.
And there are already several legal challenges to this assault-style weapon ban. And we know that the CTF recently sought intervener status in 2 of these challenges. So can you tell us a little bit more about this effort?
Yeah, there are actually a number of challenges. We've decided to try and participate in 2 of them. And the reason is that we think there were some procedural issues here. For example, there was no vote in Parliament on these new regulations. And of course, we're very concerned about the costs. We think it's an ill-advised policy. And of course, everyone is against gun crime and violence. But we think that this is not a very effective way to do it that could potentially be very expensive in the process.
And getting into the cost of this program, Public Safety Minister Bill Blair says the cost of the gun buyback program would be between $300 and $400 million. But considering the last buyback program we had, how likely will this estimate balloon to a much higher number?
Oh, very likely, frankly. And it's not just gun programs. This government has been very bad historically at estimating the cost of things. It ends up being a lot more expensive than they ever anticipate. That's our fear here. The wrinkle here is they decided they're going to make it optional. Of course, that undermines its arguable effectiveness as well. So it's really anybody's guess. But our concern is more often than not, when the government gives you an estimate, total cost ends up being a lot more.
Now, bringing this back home to our viewers, how will Canadian taxpayers be affected by this program, Mr. Woodrick? We've got over a minute left.
Yeah, well, if the cost spirals out of control, of course, it is going to be taxpayers that end up picking up the bill. There are scarce resources, and we're at a time right now where every dollar counts. We just run a deficit of almost $400 billion this year. The government needs to find cost-effective ways to do things, and spending money on a optional gun ban and buyback program that won't really do anything to address crime, but could potentially cost a lot of money, seems like a bad deal all around.
All right, sir, about a minute left, but what do you think needs to be done to improve gun laws while still respecting Canadians' wallets?
Well, I think, look, the big knock against this registry is it doesn't address what the real problems are. People are rightly concerned about gun violence and crime, and no one wants any of that in their communities. But what we do know is that most of those crimes are not committed by the types of people and the legal registered weapons that Canadians already have. They are done by criminals. That it's committed by people who have weapons that are illegal and that have been smuggled in. So if we really want to address the problem, the focus really needs to be on criminal activity, on smuggling and tackling gang activity, rather than just trying to find a way to take guns out of the hands of legal, law-abiding citizens.
All right, Mr. Woodrick, always great having you on the Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time, sir.
Thanks a lot.
Coming up next, our top stories from across Canada this past week on our Forum Daily Week in Review. We'll be right back. A new report says the federal government's decision to phase out fish farms in the Discovery Islands will result in the loss of 690 jobs in the salmon industry. The report by economics firm Riaz says an additional 845 indirect jobs will be put at risk, and more than 10.7 million young salmon and eggs will be destroyed. The BC Salmon Farmers Association is calling for the decision to be set aside to give everyone with a stake in salmon farming time to develop a plan to minimize its impacts. Premier Jason Kenney says a recent bump in energy prices will help Alberta's bottom line this fiscal year. The budget deficit was on track to exceed $21 billion by the end of March, but Mr. Kenney says it will now be around $14 billion. Tomorrow, Finance Minister Travis Taves is to table the proposed budget for the coming fiscal year, which starts in April. Mr. Kenney says it doesn't make sense to hike taxes or make deep spending cuts while dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe says he won't change his government's scheduled spring budget day, which happens to fall on the 3-year anniversary of the Humboldt Broncos bus crash. The opposition NDP says one victim's family reached out to say that it is insensitive for the Saskatchewan Party to release its budget this April 6th. Mr. Moe says no one in his caucus understands the weight of the tragedy more than his finance minister, Donna Harpower, who represents Humboldt. A proposal to establish a world-class research lab in Saskatchewan that might prove valuable during future pandemics could get a $15 million boost from the province. The University of Saskatchewan-based International Vaccine Centre has been working on its own COVID-19 vaccine candidate, which recently entered human clinical trials. Yesterday, the province pledged $15 million toward the effort, providing that the federal government kicks in another $45 million. Crime was down in a big way in Regina last year, and police say COVID-19 could have been a factor. According to the latest stats, crime in the city was down 27% compared to 2019 and was at the lowest point since 2014. Police Chief Evan Bray says COVID-19 and public health restrictions affected how people behaved. Property crime offenses against people, vehicle thefts, and meth possession were all down in 2020 compared to the previous year. A popular Assiniboine River skating trail in Winnipeg has been covered with raw sewage after a city drain pipe overflowed. The city of Winnipeg says the sewage overflow was a result of the drain becoming overrun with snowmelt, and the discharge is meant to prevent sewers from backing up into basements. One disgusted resident says it is disheartening to see raw sewage flowing on an area where thousands of people go skating, and suggests that the city needs to take a better look at how it deals with waste. The New Brunswick government is increasing the minimum wage by a nickel to $11.75 per hour on April 1st. The minimum wage rate is indexed to New Brunswick's Consumer Price Index and rounded to the nearest 5 cents. There are currently about 20,000 minimum wage earners in New Brunswick, or about 6% of the paid province. Nova Scotia's freshly sworn-in Liberal Premier Ian Rankin has created several new departments and offices in his 17-member cabinet.
Today is a great day, and such a proud day as I present to you, to the people of Nova Scotia, your new cabinet. These 16 women and men reflect the values, spirit, heritage, and the modern-day Nova Scotia.
The Premier has added a Department of Infrastructure and Housing, which will be headed by former Business Minister Jeff McLellan. He also created 2 new offices. They include the Office of Mental Health and Addictions and the Office of Equity and Anti-Racism Initiatives. A scallop fishing group says companies, individuals, and other ship owners have contributed more than $200,000 to a GoFundMe campaign for the families of 6 fishermen who went missing after their boat sank off the coast of southwestern Nova Scotia in December. The Full Bay Scallop Association says the money will go toward the estates of the lost fishermen to cover funeral costs and legal expenses, with any remaining funds divided equally among the families. Only one body has been recovered after the Chief William Solis sank on December 15th. The Nunavut government has tabled a $2 billion budget that focuses on adding more healthcare services in the territory. Finance Minister George Hicks delivered the draft document for the upcoming 2021-2022 fiscal year during his annual budget address. Last year, Mr. Hicks projected Nunavut's deficit would be the largest yet, higher than $30 million. However, it sits at $21 million because $130 million in federal funding was provided last year to help deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. All right, don't go away. Coming up next on the Forum Daily Week in Review, this week's international news from around the globe. In the U.S. this week, Republicans opposed the Democrats' $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief bill. Meanwhile, Bahrain's Crown Prince called the Israeli Prime Minister over Iran nuclear talks, and a drone attack on a Saudi Arabia palace was linked to Iran. That and more stories from around the world coming up next. Stay tuned. Republicans are rallying against the Democrats' proposed $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief bill. But even as they do, lawmakers are awaiting a decision by the Senate's parliamentarian that could bolster or potentially kill a pivotal provision hiking the federal minimum wage. Democrats plan to push the sweeping package through the House on Friday. They were hoping the Senate would follow quickly enough to have legislation on President Joe Biden's desk by mid-March. But the big suspense is over whether the nonpartisan parliamentarian will decide if the minimum wage plan can stay in the bill. Bahrain's state-run news agency says that its crown prince spoke with the Israeli prime minister on Thursday about the return to nuclear talks with Iran. The statement marks the first response from a Gulf Arab leader to President Joe Biden's announcement earlier this month that he was seeking a return to the 2015 nuclear accord. The move was welcomed by Gulf nations and Israel, Iran's foes in the region that are most directly threatened and were excluded from the last negotiations. Following the United Emirates, the island kingdom of Bahrain normalized relations with Israel last fall. A senior Iran-backed militia official in Baghdad has said 3 drones were launched from Iraqi-Saudi border areas, but a relatively unknown Iran-backed faction in Iraq and crashed into the royal complex in Riyadh on January 23rd. The comments by the senior Iraqi militia official mark the first time an Iran-backed group has acknowledged that Iraq was the origin of the attack and points to the challenges that Baghdad faces in stemming attacks by Iranian-backed militia factions in Iraq. An illegal gold mine in Indonesia's Sulawesi Island has collapsed on nearly 24 people working inside, killing 6 and leaving another worker missing. A rescue official says 15 people were pulled from the debris, along with the bodies of 4 women and 2 men, during a grueling search effort. Police, emergency personnel, soldiers, and volunteers are still trying to locate one worker. Their efforts are hampered by the remote location of the mine and the unstable soil that risks further slides. A leading rights group is accusing Libyan authorities of failing to bring justice to individuals responsible for committing war crimes. The crimes were committed during the crackdown on anti-government protests that led to the fall of longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. HRW issued a statement Thursday saying that insufficient efforts to ensure accountability could only embolden perpetrators. In February 2011, the Security Council referred Libya to the International Criminal Court during Mr. Gaddafi's clampdown on anti-government protesters. Facebook is banning all accounts linked to Myanmar's military, as well as ads from military-controlled companies in the wake of the army's seizure of power on February 1st. Director of Public Policy for the social media giant, Raphael Frankel, says the ban was precipitated by events since the coup, including deadly violence. The bans also apply on Instagram. Australia's laws forcing Google and Facebook to pay for news are ready to take effect, though the law's architect says it will take time for the digital giants to strike media deals. The Parliament passed amendments to the so-called News Media Bargaining Code, agreed between Australia's Treasurer and Facebook Chief Executive Mark Zuckerberg on Tuesday. In return for the changes, Facebook agreed to lift a ban on Australians accessing and sharing news. Facebook, following in Google's footsteps, says it plans to invest $1 billion to support the news industry over the next 3 years. The social networking giant, which has been tussling with Australia over a law that would make social platforms pay news organizations, said it has invested $600 million since 2018 for news. Google said in October that it would pay publishers $1 billion over the next 3 years. Paramount Pictures is joining other major Hollywood studios in slashing the traditional 90-day theatrical window for its films. Viacom CBS on Wednesday announced that the studio's films, including Mission Impossible 7 and A Quiet Place Part 2, will go to its fledgling Paramount Plus streaming service after 45 days in theaters. A Quiet Place Part 2 and Mission Impossible 7 have both been delayed several times and are both currently scheduled to open in the fall. 5 Atlantic Canadian breweries are working together to support the region's musicians. Breton, Grim Ross, Garrison, Upstreet Craft, and Quiddy Viddy breweries say they'll brew and release a beer in the lead-up to the East Coast Music Awards in Sydney, Nova Scotia this May. 50 cents from every can of East Coast Music Ale will be donated to the ECMA to help it promote and grow music in the region. The breweries say the effort is coming after a year of substantial disruptions for the music industry due to COVID-19. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for updates. Stay tuned for other programs coming up on our network, and be sure to tune in to our commentary shows on economics, politics, Canadian law, and social issues that affect Canadians from all over the country. All right, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next time on the Forum Daily Week in Review. Have a great weekend.